Okay, let's unpack this. We are doing a deep dive into what is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, a monumental turning point for Canadian policing.
It really is.
We're looking squarely at the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, this iconic national force, and we're analyzing these deep fundamental challenges that are now forcing provinces and the federal government to consider completely redefining how public safety is delivered.
And what's so fascinating here, I think, is that the pressure for this transformation isn't just coming from one place.
Right.
It's a perfect storm. We really have to look at this through three very distinct, I'd say equally challenging lenses that define the crisis right now.
So what are those three lenses?
Well, first, there's the deep historical trauma. I mean, the crushing weight of the RCMP's institutional roles, especially when it comes to Indigenous communities. That's one. Second, you have the immediate high-stakes failures that were just laid bare by one single horrific, critical incident, the Nova Scotia mass casualty.
And that really blew everything open.
It did. And third, that leads to these sweeping proposals for structural reform that, challenge the very nature of contract policing across multiple provinces.
That structural piece is, it's key, isn't it? We're not talking just minor policy tweaks here.
Not at all.
We're talking about provinces seriously considering tearing up the entire policing contract and just starting over. So our mission for you, the listener, is to synthesize all these detailed government and commission reports.
And we're going to try and cut through some of that policy jargon, things like fenced funding and integrated models.
Exactly. To really understand the real-world impact of what Canada is proposing. And it's big. It's about recalibrating relationships, demanding accountability, and potentially redefining public safety itself to make sure these kinds of tragedies just never happen again.
That's the goal.
So the most urgent context driving this whole wave of structural change is the final report of the Mass Casualty Commission, the MCC, which looked into the tragic events of April 2020 in Nova Scotia.
And the findings in that report are so much more than just a timeline of mistakes.
It's brutal.
It's a brutal reflection of systemic blind spots, of missed opportunities. But, it also offers a clear, even if it's a difficult, pathway for prevention. The MCC laid out a chilling foundation for how mass violence actually starts.
And that foundation, it's a real shift in perspective, isn't it?
It's a radical shift.
Yeah.
The MCC concluded unequivocally that mass casualties often begin with and escalate from unaddressed, gender-based, intimate partner or family violence.
That is a crucial reframing.
It is. It shifts the focus away from the isolated, spectacular act of mass murder and puts it squarely on the pervasive pattern of violence that is so often ignored or minimized in the home for years.
Decades someday.
Even decades, exactly. It forces law enforcement and really all of society to see domestic violence not as some private issue, but as a direct precursor to public tragedy.
That's profound. I mean, prevention isn't just about hardening targets or installing cameras.
Yeah.
It's about early, effective intervention in family dynamics. So how did this specific perpetrator's history fit that pattern?
The report detailed it explicitly. The perpetrator was raised in a violently dysfunctional home. He witnessed sustained family violence, including intimate partner violence, and he was personally abused by his father at a young age.
So the foundation was there from the start.
It was. This foundational experience of violence, it translated into a lifetime of documented, sustained violent and intimidating behaviors toward others, especially women. And crucially, the sources show this pattern of violence, combined with his illegal acquisition of firearms over many years, created just numerous red flags.
Missed opportunity.
Repeated missed opportunities for prevention, for intervention in the years leading right up to the incident. For far too long, these forms of violence were siloed. They were seen as distinct from mass violence. The MCC clearly identified that as a dangerous societal and institutional misapprehension.
And it was directly reflected in how policing failed to connect the dots.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the most chilling operational detail here. The replica cruiser. This is the element that allowed him to move and operate with impunity for hours.
The perpetrator owned a replica RCMP cruiser, and the MCC found that it was, for all intents and purposes, identical to current RCMP vehicles.
Identical.
Yes. That level of detail, combined with his disguise and an orange reflective safety vest, it gave him additional and just terrifying means to carry out the mass casualty.
And what the commission found about community knowledge of this cruiser is shocking.
It is shocking.
Right.
Multiple community residents knew about the perpetrator's replica RCMP cruiser, but not one person reported its existence to the authorities.
Why not?
Well, it points to a complete breakdown in the safety ecosystem. People may not have known how dangerous he was, but they knew he had this illegal symbol of authority. That silence, or maybe that assumption that, oh, someone else must know about this, it amplified the threat exponentially.
It really speaks to a breakdown in the public-police relationship, a lack of trust.
A fundamental lack of the trust required for citizens to flag such a critical, obvious risk.
So if we connect that to the operational response, the systemic failures in communication were just devastating.
Absolutely. Once the incident started, the RCMP's failure to publicly share accurate and timely information was a critical operational collapse. Specifically, they failed to push out clear warnings about the identical nature of the replica vehicle.
And the disguise.
And the disguise, yes. The high-visibility orange vest he was wearing. This deprived community members, people who were awake, working, or just observing of the opportunity to evaluate the risk and protect themselves.
And we know this failure put critical personnel directly in harm's way.
That's right. The sources highlight that essential workers like Victorian Order of Nurses or Vaughan employees were particularly at risk because they had to travel around the community, often early in the morning.
And they had no idea.
They received none of the accurate, timely information they needed to protect themselves, and that resulted in tragic consequences. The failure to communicate basic threat characteristics was a systemic decision, not just some momentary slip.
The failure around the public warning system feels especially incomprehensible given how long this went on. I mean, it stretched over 13 hours.
It raises the question, why did they rely on Twitter when a national system was available?
Exactly.
The command group was, and this is incredible, completely unaware of the potential to use the Alert Ready system.
Unaware.
Completely. The established national broadcast mechanism for a public warning about a mass casualty, they defaulted to social media, which is just inherently limited in reach and effectiveness during a fast-moving crisis.
And the timeline is staggering.
Well, the first 911 call mentioned the police decaled cruiser, but the first public alert about the replica vehicle via Twitter, which even included a photo with the fake call sign 28B11 crudely circled, was issued over 12 hours after that initial call.
Wait, hold on. 12 hours. And they just circled the call sign on a photo for Twitter.
Yes. The sheer delay, combined with that totally inadequate delivery method, relying on people checking Twitter during a crisis, it was a persistent operational failure. The RCMP had been aware of the importance of integrated public communications in critical incidents well before April 2020. The policy was there.
But the practice wasn't.
The procedures were just not integrated into the command structure. It highlighted a disconnect between policy and practice that cost lives.
And operationally, once they did start responding, the consensus was that the response itself was disorganized. It lacked clear leadership.
The documents confirm that. The RCMP's critical incident response was reactive. It didn't deploy resources according to a coherent, coordinated strategy. Policy and standard training offered very little guidance on how to coordinate a response to an active mobile threat.
One that was constantly changing location and disguise.
Exactly. And a key operational issue was the inadequate briefing provided to members, especially during the critical shift change on the morning of April 19th. Officers coming on duty were not fully apprised of the scale or the specific threat profile.
So information they had just wasn't being passed down or across teams effectively.
Precisely. But maybe the most crucial finding on leadership was the lack of an assigned on-scene supervisor to exercise command. That severely impeded the effectiveness of the response.
They were just chasing him.
The overall emphasis was on chasing the perpetrator, which is understandable, but this focus often came at the expense of coordinating a strategic response to do other necessary things, like securing critical areas or coordinating public information.
And the MCC found this lack of strategy actually caused more harm.
It both impeded the effectiveness of the response and, tragically at times, caused additional harm.
Yes, and the failures didn't even stop when the incident ended. The way they handled the victims and survivors afterward.
Yeah.
It just compounded the distress and mistrust.
In short, the RCMP focused on protecting its investigation and its reputation before they comprehensively addressed the needs of the victims and their families.
They prioritized institutional imperatives.
Yes. institutional and investigative imperatives over the needs of survivors and family members. This was most jarringly seen in their directive to the Nova Scotia Medical Examiner Service.
What was that directive?
They directed them not to release information about the cause, manner, and circumstances of death to the family members.
They actively withheld that crucial information from grieving families.
They did. The MCC deemed this directive completely unnecessary and harmful in the circumstances. It compounded grief and mistrust, forcing affected individuals, especially those living outside Nova Scotia who couldn't rely on local support, to face a continual uphill battle just to access basic support and funding.
A failure of compassion layered on an operational failure.
Exactly. The recommendations now stress that support services have to be community-centered, proactively planned during the preparation phase of incident management, not as an afterthought.
So these tragic failures in Nova Scotia, they really act as a major inflection point. This is what forces the shift from just reforming existing RCMP procedures to reevaluating the fundamental structure of contract policing across Canada.
This is the moment the discussion goes national and structural.
A federal House of Commons committee examined systemic racism in policing and came to a pretty stark conclusion about the RCMP's dual role.
They found that providing contract policing for provinces, territories, and municipalities while also trying to handle critical federal policing duties, well, it made it incredibly difficult for the organization to focus effectively on community needs.
It creates an internal conflict.
An internal conflict of interest and capacity, absolutely. When local contract policing needs are surging, federal priorities like cybercrime or national security, they often suffer because the personnel are stretched thin trying to fill local gaps.
And the committee took a radical position on this.
They did. They recommended that the federal government explore the possibility of ending the RCMP's contract policing role entirely. This is a potential dismantling of the core business model the RCMP has used for decades.
And that recommendation is now translating into real action at the provincial level. This isn't just theory anymore.
That's right. Multiple provinces are now formally examining alternatives. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, they've all decided to examine the feasibility of replacing the RCMP with a dedicated provincial police service.
But two provinces are much further down the path.
Much further.
Let's start with Alberta. They've produced a comprehensive plan for what they're calling the Alberta Police Service model. What does that structural change actually look like?
The proposed model is extremely detailed. It addresses both governance and, that perennial sticking point for municipalities.
Right.
Money. Structurally, it would move control closer to the communities. It mandates establishing a provincial police commission and local police commissions. This deliberately increases the role Alberta communities have in setting their own policing priorities.
So moving the focus away from Ottawa.
Exactly. Away from centralized federal authority. This is meant to ensure the police service is directly accountable to local needs, not federal mandates.
And what about the money? I mean, ending the RCMP contract means provinces suddenly have to pay the full bill, which can be politically impossible.
And that's where the financial mechanism is pretty ingenious, because it neutralizes that political risk. The proposal aims to absorb the current RCMP policing costs, which are partially covered by the federal government, without raising provincial taxes or imposing additional costs on municipalities.
How do they do that?
Essentially, the provincial government proposes to take the funding that was previously sent to the federal government for the contract and redirect it to the new provincial service. This ensures the transition is fiscally neutral for local taxpayers.
That's a clever way to handle it.
It is, and the model also explicitly aims to reimagine policing in Indigenous communities by working closely with them to realize their distinct needs, moving away from a one-size-fits-all model.
Meanwhile, on the West Coast, British Columbia is also moving with significant momentum.
An all-party committee of MLAs in BC recommended transitioning from the RCMP to a fully independent provincial police service. And in BC, the transition isn't theoretical. We have a live operational example happening right now.
You're talking about Surrey.
The city of Surrey is actively replacing the RCMP with its own municipal police service, the Surrey Police Service. The national momentum is clear. There is a growing consensus that the contract model is structurally inadequate for modern community needs.
This national movement means we have to look at new operational models. Let's look at Halifax, the HRM, where integrated policing is the proposed solution. What does that term actually mean?
Integrated policing is a model where two or more distinct police services, in this case, the municipal police and the contract RCMP, would operate as a single entity. They'd share resources, command structures. The core idea is that your uniform or your badge makes absolutely no difference. All operations are coordinated, standardized, and governed uniformly.
So this is way more than just simple cooperation.
Far different. Simple cooperation means they, talk to each other occasionally or share resources during a crisis. True integration means standardizing things like patrol zones, data systems, tactical responses. The critique of the current HRM model is that there's virtually no integration.
So this would require a total overhaul.
A total overhaul. Coordinated joint management teams, unified patrol management, to ensure seamless service delivery and, crucially, to prevent the kind of information siloing that contributed to the Nova Scotia tragedy.
And the proposal for enhanced governance is equally transformative, particularly for the Halifax Board of Police Commissioners, the BOPC. Governance is where accountability lives, right?
Precisely. And the goal here is to decenter the traditional profile of who sits on police oversight boards. The recommendation is for the BOPC to use a board composition matrix, a deliberate analytical tool to ensure a diverse and representative mix of membership.
What does that mean in practice?
It means prioritizing Indigenous, African Nova Scotian, rural, and urban representation to ensure the voice of the community is truly heard.
And they're mandating specific professional expertise, which seems like a major signal of intent.
It is. They are mandating expertise deemed essential for modern public safety oversight like strategic planning, IT and security, risk management. But critically, they require expertise in health and social services.
That's a huge shift.
It signals that policing oversight must be multifaceted. It cannot be strictly law enforcement focused if it's going to address the root causes of crime and distress. And the board is also recommended to get additional dedicated funds to hire outside expertise as required.
So they're not relying on the police for all their information.
Exactly.
That inclusion of health and social services expertise, that links directly back to the MCC findings and this urgent need for multidisciplinary responses, taking the burden of social crises off of armed police officers.
It does. The lesson learned is that police cannot and should not handle all complex calls involving mental health, homelessness, or addiction. Multidisciplinary approaches have proven benefits not just in outcomes but in efficiency.
Oh, so.
They reduce the load on frontline armed response, and they also result in significant cost savings and better client engagement with follow-up care.
Can you give us an example of a successful multidisciplinary model?
Well, the quintessential example cited in the source materials from Eugene, Oregon. It's called CAHOOTS Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets.
CAHOOTS?
It's a remarkable system. Instead of police, CAHOOTS dispatches two-person teams, a medic, a nurse, paramedic or EMT, and a crisis worker, both highly trained in mental health intervention. They respond to crisis situations involving mental illness, homelessness, addiction.
So they're effectively diverting these complex social calls away from armed police.
Yes, which drastically reduces the risk of escalation and inappropriate use of force.
That must be a massive relief for frontline officers who are often just not equipped to handle those complex health crises.
It is. And the focus is also shifting to what happens after an offense. Beyond the initial response, the Halifax study also highlighted these really robust models for restorative justice that provide alternatives to the traditional punitive system.
Tell us more about the Community Justice Society and HRM and how they approach this.
The Community Justice Society and HRM is a sophisticated example of how you can weave restorative justice into the criminal justice system at various stages. It goes far beyond just simple mediation for minor offenses. The key is its extensive system of 4 referral entry points.
Okay, let's walk through those entry points.
So first, you have the police entry point. This is pre-charge. For things like petty crimes, shoplifting, the police can divert the case before it even enters the court system, allowing for a community resolution. Second is the Crown entry point. This is post-charge but pre-conviction. It covers most offenses. Here, the Crown attorney decides to divert the case based on an assessment of the offender and the victim's willingness to participate.
So even if formal charges are laid, you can still avoid a conviction through community-led justice.
Precisely. Third, the court entry point is post-conviction but pre-sentence. This is critical because it covers much more serious offenses: manslaughter, impaired driving causing death, aggravated assault.
Wow. So even for serious violent crime.
Yes. Even after a conviction, the court can use the restorative process to inform the sentence, focusing on making amends to the community or the victim's family rather than purely punitive incarceration. It recognizes the deep harm caused, but seeks a path for the offender to meaningfully engage with that harm.
And the last one.
Finally, there's the corrections entry point, which is post-sentence. This covers even the most serious offenses, including murder. These referrals come from correctional services or victim services. It shows a system that's committed to rehabilitation and community restoration, not just a moment in a courtroom.
We really can't talk about fixing the RCMP without addressing the elephant in the room.
The crushing weight of history.
Exactly. The history, specifically its role in the residential schools. It's impossible to discuss this tipping point for Canadian policing without addressing the deep, devastating history of the RCMP's role during the Indian residential school system. It remains the single most potent source of current community distrust.
And for Indigenous peoples, the RCMP was never simply a police force. It was a primary agent of colonization and enforcement. To understand the extent of this role, we have to look far beyond traditional law enforcement duties.
So they were more than just police officers.
Much more. Especially in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, the RCMP was considered the most suitable agency to represent Indian affairs because of its wide reach, its ability to patrol and visit vast areas. They were, in essence, a bureaucratic arm of the government.
Can you give some examples of those duties?
The sources detail extensive non-policing administrative duties. Think about the scope. They acted as registrars of vital statistics. They administered family allowances for Eskimos. They issued Eskimo identification cards and those infamous brass discs.
Wow.
They issued licenses for everything from game and fur export to liquor and motor vehicles. In remote communities, the RCMP was the visible, uniformed extension of federal authority overseeing nearly every facet of Indigenous life.
So they were an occupying, controlling force, not a community safety partner.
That's how they were established. And the legal framework that cemented this colonial role was the Indian Act. The 1876 Indian Act consolidated all the existing legislation, codified the rules, and rendered Aboriginals legal wards of the federal government. This act centralized power. And then in 1920, a critical legislative amendment was made to compel school attendance for all Indian children between 6 and 16.
And this is where the police role transitions from administrator to coercive enforcer.
Precisely. And the RCMP's role as the truant officer directly resulted in profound and lasting trauma that echoes today.
What do the archives show about this?
The dated documents that the RCMP was repeatedly asked by Indian agents and school principals to search for and forcibly bring children to these residential schools. The descriptions from the time detailed in the source material are harrowing. They must be remembered.
Like what?
There were organized fall roundups where constables would approach houses, sometimes demanding the parents give up their children under threat of fines or jail time.
So they used threats.
In one documented case, constables rushed into a house to pry screaming children from their parents' arms before marching them away. In other areas, children were rounded up and transported via cattle cars to distant schools. This wasn't subtle coercion. This was direct physical enforcement by armed officers.
The RCMP were directly enforcing the compulsory attendance system,
making them utterly complicit in the separation of families and the trauma that followed.
And even when children ran away from the schools, which happened frequently because of the abuse and neglect, the RCMP was instrumental in bringing them back.
It was documented as common practice for the RCMP to apprehend runaways and bring them back to the institutions. In one recorded case in Saskatchewan, an 11-year-old runaway was escorted back to the school by the RCMP on the train in handcuffs. In handcuffs. Other records detail police patrols picking up runaway boys, keeping them overnight in the detachment office, and then handing them over to the school principal the next morning. This physical enforcement reinforced the perception that the police were an extension of the church and state authority that imprisoned them. That memory is still alive.
That context is everything.
It is.
And this leads us to the internal management of abuse within the schools and how that contributed to the lack of outside intervention.
Well, problems, including alleged sexual and physical abuse, were overwhelmingly dealt with internally by the principal or supervisors. To avoid scandal, to avoid anything that would negatively affect the institution's reputation and funding. Wrongdoers might be warned or removed, or sometimes, tragically, no action was taken at all. The commission noted that the woeful mistreatment, neglect, and abuse of many children were facts known, or that should have been known, to the department and the churches.
Given those power dynamics, it's understandable that victims rarely came forward to police, even when serious crimes occurred.
Absolutely. The deep lack of trust meant victims felt they couldn't influence the system. Before the 1990s, RCMP records show very few complaints of sexual or physical abuse relating to the schools.
What did the former students say?
They stated clearly that they did not trust the police because they didn't feel the RCMP was there to help them. They saw them as racist or just too closely connected to the government and church authority that had inflicted the trauma. It created an overwhelming culture of silence around abuse.
A culture only broken decades later.
Decades later, when former students gained the strength to come forward and initiate criminal investigations.
That history, that legacy of colonial policing, it just directly informs the modern challenges faced by Indigenous policing today.
It creates an enormous, almost insurmountable barrier to success for modern initiatives designed to bridge this gap. The First Nations Policing Program, the FNPP, established in 1992 to provide self-administered culturally appropriate services, has struggled tremendously.
How
The sources note that over one-third of these fledgling services have disbanded. They're often hampered by inadequate short-term funding, and the inherent disadvantage of smaller forces struggle to provide 247 services and specialized units. The result is ongoing community distrust, even in areas striving for self-determination.
Because the historical specter of the RCMP still looms large.
Exactly.
But Indigenous communities aren't waiting for the federal government to fix this. They are forging ahead with their own justice models that directly contrast this painful history.
They are. They're building systems focused on healing, restoration, and cultural relevance. We see models like the Tsuut'ina Peacemaking Court in Alberta, which is focused explicitly on healing and restoration rather than retribution and incarceration.
Are there specific language or cultural elements incorporated?
Yes. There is the Saskatchewan Cree Court, which is a Cree-speaking provincial court that uses cultural knowledge to investigate the background of crimes and attempts to divert offenders from jail through restorative justice.
And in cities?
In urban environments, we have the Toronto Gladue Court, which meets weekly to assess the background of offenders taking into account their history, including residential school intergenerational trauma, and makes recommendations for sentencing alternatives. These models acknowledge the systemic context that historic colonial policing aggressively ignored.
So to match this external demand for structural reform, the RCMP is now outlining its internal organizational commitment to change. Let's turn inward now. If the foundation is broken, you have to start at the source. Depot. What are the key proposals for transforming who the RCMP hires and how they train them?
The organization recognizes the need for a fundamental cultural shift, starting with recruitment and training modernization at Depot in Regina. The National Police Federation has provided concrete recommendations aiming to stabilize staffing.
Okay, like what?
First, expanding the capacity of depot training from 40 to at least 55 troops per year to rapidly address severe staffing shortages across the country.
And what about the applicant pool itself? Are they trying to make it easier for diverse candidates to join?
Absolutely. Second, they are recommending streamlining and modernizing the application process, which has historically been a real impediment. This includes aligning the RCMP's permanent residency requirements with those of the Canadian Armed Forces to widen the applicant pool.
And they're addressing the financial side of training.
Yes, recognizing the pressures on cadets who can't work during training, they recommend significantly increasing the cadet training allowance to about $1,200 a week. This is a crucial step to ensure the applicant pool isn't limited to only those who can afford 9 months without a competitive income.
But the modernization effort goes beyond just logistics. It's about changing the curriculum and, potentially, the very existence of the depot model.
That's the most revolutionary part. DECO is engaged in a significant modernization effort involving academics from the University of Regina and the First Nations University of Canada. This suggests a curriculum that is attempting to incorporate modern academic and cultural expertise, particularly Indigenous history and reconciliation.
A dramatic shift from the traditionally insular military-style training.
Very much so. But the MCC recommendation went even further than just changing the curriculum. It suggested a clean break from the past.
What was that recommendation?
It recommended a systemic break by phasing out the traditional depot model of centralized training by 2032. This is a profoundly symbolic and operational recommendation because Depot is the single most important physical and symbolic center for the RCMP.
Closing it would signify a complete divorce from the RCMP's historical identity.
Completely. And furthermore, the recommendation mandates consulting with the Métis and the Saskatchewan Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, the FSIN, regarding the land and facilities' future use. It acknowledges the land's history and the need for Indigenous input.
Let's pivot back to the problems created by that dual mandate, the gaps in federal policing. If they are constantly backfilling local contracts, they can't focus on national security.
And to address this resource leak, the core recommendation is to establish dedicated fenced funding for federal policing.
Why fence?
Because historically, federal funding meant for things like cybercrime investigations or organized crime could be functionally absorbed or diluted by local contract policing shortages. Fenced funding stops that operational leak. It ensures federal priorities are actually resourced and protected.
And how do they staff these specialized federal priorities if general duty officers are already stretched thin?
The recommendation is to adequately fund and expand the Special Constable program. This program is designed to attract specialized talent people with expertise in finance, cyber analysis, data science, who don't necessarily need or want to undergo full-armed general duty training.
Because modern threats demand that kind of specialized expertise.
An expertise that's not typically found in the general duty member recruited through the traditional depot system.
One of those complex, specialized threats is cybercrime, which requires a complete paradigm shift in policing.
Absolutely. Cybercrime is no longer an ancillary issue. It has an immediate, tangible, and ongoing impact on Canada's economy, critical infrastructure, and individuals often involving grievous harm like child sexual exploitation and massive financial loss. The sources emphasize that the RCMP cybercrime strategy requires a complete paradigm shift.
What does that operational framework look like?
It's a multi-pronged approach. It focuses on enhanced intelligence collection to identify and prioritize threats moving from reactive to proactive. It emphasizes targeted enforcement against key actors, and crucially, it involves supporting investigations with specialized skills, tools, and training.
So how are they planning to improve their actual technical capabilities to handle all this digital evidence?
The strategy emphasizes improving digital evidence capabilities. They need to be able to operate effectively in online environments through open source and covert means. This includes providing dedicated, rapid digital forensic support and, crucially, acquiring new operational tools to analyze large and complex volumes of digital evidence more effectively and quickly.
Finally, let's discuss the governance and accountability mechanisms mandated by the MCC to ensure these changes are more than just policy documents sitting on a shelf.
Organizational accountability is the ultimate goal. The MCC recommendations require a truly holistic approach. This includes explicitly clarifying the command and control model, a direct response to the confusion that plagued the 2020 incident, and reviewing and updating critical incident training regimes across the country.
Because the failure of leadership to know their roles was a severe finding.
It was. The solution must be organizational clarity and mandated practice.
But the critical structural step to enforce this for the long term is the new monitoring body.
That is the anchor of the reform process. The recommendation is for the federal and Nova Scotia governments to establish and fund an implementation and mutual accountability body. This body is crucial for providing mutual accountability, exchanging knowledge, and consulting with community members. It has to establish a robust monitoring framework to ensure the full and timely implementation of the recommendations.
Without that mandated oversight, there's a risk the recommendations just fade over time.
A very high risk.
The last detail we have here is surprising, but incredibly telling about institutional risk management. The management of police kit. It speaks volumes about closing every possible loophole.
It really does. Given the critical role the misuse of the replica cruiser and uniform played in the mass casualty weaponizing the symbol of authority, the MCC provided a very specific recommendation.
Which was?
That the RCMP and other police services review their policies on the management and disposal of police uniform and associated kit.
So they need to treat a uniform like a firearm, essentially.
Functionally, yes, in terms of accountability. This means establishing proactive and effective measures for inventory management and disposal, a formalized process for tracking issued, returned, and destroyed items. It ensures that the symbol of authority cannot be casually or accidentally weaponized against the public in the future.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We have charted a course from these immediate critical operational failures in Nova Scotia, like the breakdown of the Alert Ready system, the shocking misuse of the replica cruiser, to fundamental proposals to end the contract policing model across the country.
With provinces like Alberta and BC moving toward autonomous provincial services.
And the tension is so clear. Canada needs to rapidly adopt new technologies and governance models, like integrated policing and dedicated cyber units, but it must simultaneously confront and integrate the deep historical trauma inflicted on Indigenous communities through the RCMP's role as truant officers and enforcers of the residential school system.
It just reaffirms the core message of the Mass Casualty Commission, the necessity of focusing on prevention. We have to stop treating mass violence as an isolated event and recognize that it often begins years earlier with unaddressed gender-based violence, family violence, or intimate partner violence.
Right.
Moving forward successfully requires establishing safety ecosystems that are truly driven by community needs, defined by diverse boards, multidisciplinary teams like cahoots, and sophisticated restorative justice programs. It can't just be police strategy.
This shift demands that we redefine what public safety even means.
The focus has to be on preventing the escalation of violent behaviors, investigating and protecting safety before a catastrophic event occurs.
We've seen recommendations for structural, operational, and cultural change, stretching from police accountability boards to the closure of the depot training model by 2032. So when the foundation of public safety is built on a history of institutional distrust, particularly in Indigenous communities, can the future of Canadian policing be secured just by modernizing its tools and governance? Or must its entire historical and operational mandate be fundamentally redefined?
And what is the role of citizens? Especially in reporting concerns about violence, even if it seems minor, and collaborating on safety. How do we ensure that these long overdue, painful, and necessary transformations actually stick?
This is a national conversation that truly belongs to all of us.